The spring sun burned down on the Sicilian docks as Italian POWs, many of them young nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries, were loaded onto American transport ships. Among them were women who had spent years in uniform, believing that capture would mean humiliation or worse. They had been told that the Americans were brutes, that no soldier from across the Atlantic could respect an enemy woman. But as they were handed canteens of cold water and guided up the gangplanks, the reality already felt different from the rumors. The guards were tall, clean-shaven, their uniforms immaculate. They spoke quietly to each other, not shouting, not mocking. Several women noticed something else. Some of these American soldiers were strikingly handsome, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, their confidence unlike anything they had seen at home. That realization unsettled them as much as the capture itself. They had expected monsters. They found men. The ship's lower decks had been refitted as temporary quarters. Bunks lined the walls, canvas stretched tight, lanterns swaying with the motion of the sea. Food was passed out, white bread, coffee, and tins of meat. Some refused at first, still expecting trickery, but hunger overcame pride. One Italian auxiliary, barely 20, caught a guard glancing at her, not with contempt, but with an awkward, almost shy curiosity. It was a look she didn't know how to interpret. In her world, enemy soldiers didn't look at prisoners that way. Whispers spread among the women below deck. They're polite, too polite. Some giggled nervously, others grew defensive. No one could yet imagine how captivity would evolve. But even in those first hours, the old stereotypes were cracking, replaced by a more dangerous uncertainty. And as the ship moved toward the American coast, the prisoners realized they were stepping into a future no one had warned them about. The bus rumbled through rolling hills as the Italian women peered out of the dusty windows. Beyond the barbed wire fence, they glimpsed neat rows of wooden barracks and tall watchtowers. They had expected a grim fortress, but the camp looked more like a small town. Gardens between buildings, laundry fluttering on lines, guards strolling rather than marching. When the doors opened, the women stepped down into the sunlight. American soldiers stood waiting in crisp uniforms, their rifles slung but not raised. The first thing many noticed was the smell, freshly baked bread and cut grass, not the acrid odor of oil and gunpowder they associated with captivity. They were led through a quick registration process. Names, ages, and occupations were written down. A medic took pulses and temperatures with clinical efficiency. Some of the guards smiled awkwardly, offering canteens of water or gesturing toward shaded benches. This gentleness only deepened the women's confusion. More than once, an Italian nurse caught a guard's gaze holding hers a fraction too long. It was not lust or ridicule, but something she couldn't name. Interest, perhaps. Whispers passed between the women. They're staring at us. Not like prisoners, like... No one finished the sentence aloud. They were assigned bunks in barracks, separate from the men, each with a thin mattress, clean sheets, and a small trunk for belongings. It was far more than they had expected. When trays of food arrived, chicken stew, bread, and coffee, the surprise deepened. Some of the guards lingered nearby, chatting quietly in English, glancing over as the women ate. One soldier, tall and dark-haired, helped an older Italian auxiliary lift her bag to the top bunk. He smiled shyly and stepped back. She blinked, startled by the courtesy. For the first time since capture, some of the women relaxed their shoulders. They were still prisoners, but something else was happening. Something that did not fit any story they had been told. It was in the soft glances, the careful tone of voice, and the awkward smiles that an unspoken truth began to surface. They were not just captives. They were young women, and the men around them, even in uniform, had begun to notice. Morning sunlight streamed through the barracks windows. The Italian POWs dressed in their issued uniforms, still stiff with newness. Outside, American soldiers moved along the walkways, their boots striking a steady rhythm. At first, the women avoided eye contact, convinced any interaction would bring trouble. But the guards were not harsh. They nodded politely, some even tipping their caps. When the women lined up for breakfast, trays clattering in their hands, a few guards quietly translated menu items into broken Italian, gesturing with smiles. One soldier passed an extra slice of bread to a shy nurse at the end of the line. She hesitated, then took it, whispering a soft grazie. Later in the yard, groups of women were assigned to light duties, sorting linens, tending small gardens, helping in kitchens. Everywhere they went, American soldiers supervised but never raised their voices. The atmosphere began to feel more like an awkward social experiment than a prison. Small kindnesses became daily occurrences. Doors held open, buckets carried, paths cleared. One Italian clerk dropped a bundle of laundry. Before she could stoop, a young American guard knelt first, handing it back with an embarrassed grin. Whispers spread through the women's barracks that night. He smiled at me today. They're not what we were told. Some laughed softly, teasing each other about which guard looked the most handsome. Others warned against being deceived, insisting it was all part of some psychological game. But the smiles kept coming, and so did the glances. For the first time since their capture, the women began to feel the faintest stirrings of curiosity stronger than fear. The line between captor and captive blurred in tiny ways. A glance held too long, a tone of voice gentler than expected. And in those small, unplanned moments, the first seeds of something dangerous to war itself began to take root. Recognition. They were women. The soldiers were men, and no code of war could erase that simple human fact. And though no one dared say it aloud, everyone sensed it. The walls between them were starting to thin. Afternoons in the camp became a quiet routine. Laundry drying in the breeze, guards pacing their posts, and Italian voices drifting from the barracks. On one side of the yard, a low fence separated the women's section from a supply area where American soldiers stacked crates. It was here that the first hesitant words began. A young guard with sandy hair offered a cigarette through the wire, gesturing questioningly. An Italian nurse shook her head, then smiled despite herself. Another day, another guard tried his few Italian words. Buongiorno? Acqua? The women giggled softly at his clumsy accent. Soon, fragments of conversation sprouted across the fence. Names exchanged, jokes translated by gestures, drawings sketched in the dirt to bridge the language gap. For the prisoners, it was dizzying. They had been trained to believe these men were their enemies, yet here they were, teasing, smiling, learning Italian words just to speak to them. One American soldier passed a folded paper through the wire. It was a simple drawing of a flower. The Italian woman who took it stared at it for a long time before tucking it into her pocket. Not every interaction was allowed. Senior guards frowned at too much friendliness, but the small exchanges kept happening. Too quiet, too human to suppress completely. In the evenings, the women whispered about these moments in their bunks. Some dismissed them as meaningless. Others felt their hearts race in ways they had not expected in captivity. The change was subtle, but real. The fence was still there, but now it felt less like a wall and more like a border across which glances and words could travel. One Italian auxiliary, older than the rest, warned, "Be careful. This is war." But her warning rang hollow even to herself, because in the heat of the Sicilian sun, With the smell of fresh bread in the air and the sound of American accents drifting closer each day, the war already seemed far away. The prisoners began to realize that perhaps the most dangerous thing in the camp was not punishment, but the slow erosion of the enemy image they had been taught to hold. And through each shy greeting, each gesture through the wire, that erosion was steadily at work. By midsummer, the atmosphere of the camp had shifted. The Americans still patrolled with rifles, but now their hands often carried something else: letters, food, and small surprises for the prisoners. A guard passed a packet of chewing gum through the fence. Another handed over a small bunch of wildflowers he'd picked near the road. The Italian women accepted these offerings cautiously at first. Then, slowly, they began to smile when the guards approached, even waiting at the fence at certain hours. One nurse, fluent in a few English words, became an unofficial translator. She would tease the guards for their bad Italian, and then explain their jokes to the other women. Sometimes the Americans would draw cartoons on scraps of paper and slip them under the fence. One depicted a clumsy soldier tripping over his own boots. The women laughed until tears filled their eyes. The gifts grew bolder. An apple saved from a guard's own lunch, a page from an American magazine showing movie stars none of the Italians had ever seen. Every exchange was technically forbidden, but the small acts went unnoticed in the wider machinery of the camp. The women began to reciprocate. They folded tiny paper cranes, embroidered handkerchiefs, or wrote simple Italian phrases for the guards to practice. These gestures built an unspoken bridge between captor and captive, a bridge built on curiosity rather than power. Evenings in the barracks became animated with quiet chatter. Who had received a flower? Who had been given a sweet? Who had blushed when a guard smiled? The walls of fear continued to crumble. The women were still behind barbed wire, but the wire no longer felt impenetrable. One evening, an American soldier slipped a small harmonica tune through the night air. Several Italian women hummed along from their bunks, their voices soft but unmistakable. In those shared moments, war seemed to pause. The two sides glimpsed not enemies, but ordinary young people caught in an extraordinary situation. And in that pause, the seeds of something forbidden began to take root, an attraction neither side had planned for. By late summer, the routines of the camp had settled into something almost domestic. Yet beneath the surface, a current of tension and curiosity pulsed stronger than ever. The women no longer flinched when guards approached. They looked up, sometimes even smiling. And in return, some of the Americans lingered a little too long at the fence, their eyes betraying more than duty. It began with looks. Glances held a moment past what was proper, eyes flicking away only when another guard appeared. Then came words whispered through the fence when supervisors were gone, simple questions like, "How are you?" or "Your name," in broken Italian. For the Italian women, it was dizzying. They had expected ridicule, yet instead they heard voices softened by shyness, curiosity, even admiration. One soldier, tall and awkward, began leaving small notes tucked into folded paper cranes. The women would pass them among themselves, reading the clumsy handwriting by candlelight. Another asked for Italian words, scribbling them on scraps of cardboard. He repeated them under his breath, practicing until his accent made the women laugh. Even simple things, a smile, a gesture, a shared joke, became charged. They were no longer anonymous prisoners. They were individuals noticed by individuals. In the barracks, some women warned against danger. This is still war. Don't forget, others whispered excitedly about who might like whom, as though the camp were a strange, inverted village. The Americans were careful, too. They still carried rifles, still saluted officers. But off-duty, leaning against the fence in the evening light, They seemed less like soldiers and more like young men far from home. This tension was forbidden, yet undeniable. The women felt it every time a guard passed a flower, every time a hand brushed another through the wire. The war outside the fence raged on, but inside it, something entirely different was beginning to unfold, something neither side had expected. It was no longer just survival or kindness. It was a flicker of human connection. The first small spark of something far more dangerous to war than weapons: empathy. And once empathy appeared, it could not be easily contained by barbed wire or military regulations. As autumn approached, the days shortened, and the camp took on a muted glow in the evening light. The fences cast long shadows, and the air cooled enough for jackets. Dusk became the hour of quiet exchanges. Guards lingered near the women's compound after roll call, leaning against posts, speaking softly in a mix of English and halting Italian. The Italian POWs, once huddled together in silence, now gathered near the fence, their faces faintly lit by the orange sky. Small gifts moved back and forth, a postcard of New York tucked into a sleeve, a string of beads crafted from scrap wire, a few lines of poetry written on a torn ration label. One guard began sketching caricatures of the women, exaggerating their features in a way that made them laugh, even as they tried to hide their smiles from the senior officers. Another played a soft tune on his harmonica, drawing a hush over the compound. The women leaned closer to listen, some closing their eyes as though transported back to their villages. These moments at dusk blurred the boundaries between two worlds, inside the wire and outside it. The Americans were still guards, the women still prisoners, yet the ritual of evening conversation became something apart from war. Some of the women began to share bits of their own lives, towns they had come from, brothers lost at the front, favorite songs from their childhoods. The guards, in turn, spoke of far-off states, Texas, Ohio, California, places that sounded like myths to the Italians, vast and distant. It was a strange intimacy built on scraps of information, half-understood words, and the universal language of gesture. Every evening ended the same way, with a glance over a shoulder to be sure no officer was watching, a last exchanged smile, and then retreat back to the barracks. In the bunks afterward, the women whispered about the guards, about their homes, about the mystery of a country so wealthy it could give its captives bread and music. The fence still stood, but dusk had become their shared hour, a time when even war seemed to hold its breath. And in that suspended twilight, the possibility of genuine affection flickered just beneath the surface of guarded eyes. By late autumn, the camp's quiet evening rituals were no longer a secret. Senior officers began to notice the glances, the extra gifts, the laughter drifting over the fences. The first official warnings came down in clipped English and broken Italian. No fraternizing, no gifts, no talking after hours, but human curiosity is not so easily contained. Even as rules were read aloud, eyes met across the yard with the same warmth and defiance as before. Inside the barracks, whispers thickened into rumors. He likes her. They're writing notes. Someone saw a guard pass her chocolate. Some women rolled their eyes, insisting it was just talk. Others blushed and stayed quiet, clutching small keepsakes under their pillows. The guards faced their own tension. They were soldiers under orders, yet many were barely older than the women they guarded. The war outside dragged on, but inside the camp, life slowed, became personal. Every day, the possibility of punishment hovered over them. Yet the attraction persisted. A glance, a smile, a few whispered words across a forbidden distance. One Italian auxiliary scolded a younger woman for speaking too openly to a guard. "This is dangerous, don't you see?" But the warning lacked conviction even as she said it. That night, the harmonica tune didn't come. The fence stayed silent. Some of the women felt the absence like a physical ache. In the flickering light of the barracks, the women debated whether the Americans were sincere or simply playing a deeper game. The uncertainty fed both fear and hope. Even as rules tightened, the memory of warmth persisted. Notes and smiles became more precious precisely because they were forbidden. The barbed wire still glinted under the watchlights, but to those on both sides of it, the fence had become less a barrier and more a stage for a drama neither army could control. And in the growing tension of late autumn, the question hung in the air like the winter fog. Could a small human connection survive the weight of war? No one knew yet, but the rumor of it alone was enough to stir both longing and fear. Winter settled over the camp like a gray blanket. Frost edged the barbed wire, and the once dusty yard turned to hardened earth. The mood grew quiet, yet charged. It was during these colder weeks that a handful of guards began lingering closer to the barracks doors, their hands tucked in pockets, speaking softly in the steam of their own breath. One evening, a guard slipped a folded note under the barracks door. A clumsy sketch of a Christmas tree with the words, "For you," scrawled beneath. Inside, the Italian women passed it around like contraband. Some laughed, some cried, and some sat silently staring at the paper as though it were a fragment of another world. Later, during roll call, a young American soldier caught the eye of one of the nurses. He nodded just once, a small gesture, but one that seemed to hold an entire conversation. For the first time, she didn't look away. The guard's expression softened. Awkward, hesitant, but undeniably human. The women whispered about it all night. Was it affection? Was it pity? Was it simply the loneliness of young men and women thrown together by a war they hadn't chosen? Yet even as they debated, they could not deny the warmth it gave them in the frozen barracks. It was proof that beyond uniforms and orders, there still lived the possibility of connection. Each time a smile passed through the wire, it felt like a defiance of the war itself. Each shared glance, each small kindness, was a rebellion against everything they had been told. For the Italian women, the shock was no longer just at being treated humanely. It was at the realization that they were seen, noticed, perhaps even admired. Some clung to this idea as hope. Others feared it as danger. But all of them felt its pull. The war outside remained brutal. Reports filtered in of bombings, battles, and starvation back home. Yet inside the camp, the smallest gestures of humanity glowed like coals in the cold. And in that glow, the women sensed the most forbidden possibility of all, that their captors might care for them not as enemies, but as people. Maybe even more than people. It was an idea too dangerous to speak aloud, but impossible to forget once glimpsed. Spring crept back into the camp. The snow melted and green shoots appeared near the fence line. The women sensed something shifting, not just the season, but their time inside the wire. Rumors of prisoner exchanges and releases spread like sparks. Lists were read aloud. Names were checked and rechecked. Each announcement carried both hope and a pang of loss. Some women clutched small tokens given by guards, drawings, scraps of cloth, even just a harmonica note remembered from a winter night. They didn't know if they would be allowed to keep them. The Americans, too, seemed different. The guards spoke more quietly, some lingering at the fence in the fading afternoons as if trying to memorize faces. One nurse, who had once arrived trembling and silent, now found herself thanking a guard for bringing her an extra blanket during the coldest nights. His only reply had been a shy nod. The women looked back on the first days, on the terror, the shame, the warnings they had whispered to one another, and marveled at how far reality had drifted from the stories they had been told. They were still prisoners. Yet within the confines of the camp, they had discovered something both forbidden and human, that kindness could survive even in war, and attraction could bloom even between enemies. Some women feared what awaited them after release. Could they ever explain the strange mixture of fear and warmth they had lived? Could they tell families back home that not all of the enemy fit the image in their minds? At night, lying on their bunks, they imagined the outside world, Italy's ruins, hungry cities, families waiting. And they imagined the guards too, faces now etched into their memories. When the day of departure finally came, the women walked out of the barracks carrying their issued bags. The guards stood at their posts, rifles slung but silent. Some dared to glance back one last time. A few guards lifted their hands in small, unspoken farewells. Nothing dramatic, just a final acknowledgement of something shared and unrepeatable. For the women, the greatest shock of all was not capture or hunger or confinement. It was discovering that in a place built for enemies, they had found a reflection of their own humanity. And as they stepped beyond the wire, the memory of glances, notes, and shy smiles followed them. Reminders that even in war, the heart could slip past every barrier. For long after the war ended, those memories would flicker, quiet proof that even behind fences, two sides had once met, not as conqueror and captive, but as people.